On my 50th birthday, the house was filled with the kind of warmth that makes you believe your life has been well lived. The scent of vanilla candles mixing with roasted chicken, soft gospel music humming in the background, laughter rising and falling like it always had in our home for decades. I stood there in my favorite blue dress, the one my husband once said made me look timeless, smiling as guests hugged me and told me how blessed I was, how strong my marriage looked, how lucky I was to have a man who never forgot a birthday. I smiled so much my face began to ache, but I told myself it was happiness. 30 years of marriage teaches a woman how to smile on command, how to hide the quiet questions she's learned not to ask. My husband moved through the room restlessly, checking his phone, glancing at the door, his joy looking forced in a way I couldn't quite explain. Then, just as I lifted my glass to thank everyone for coming, the doorbell rang. Once, then again, and something in my chest tightened. He froze. The music kept playing, but the room felt suddenly heavy. He stood up too fast, knocking his chair backward, and said, "There's something I need to share today." His voice cracked, and in that moment, every unexplained absence, every late-night call, every business trip rushed back to me like a tide I had been holding off for years. When the door opened, they stepped inside. A woman about my age, her hands clasped together like she was holding herself upright, and behind her 3 grown children who carried my husband's face as if it had been stamped into their bones. The laughter died. Plates stopped clinking. Someone gasped. Someone whispered my name. And as I stood there, surrounded by people who thought they knew my life, I realized that my birthday was never meant to be a celebration. It was a revelation, and nothing I had built over 30 years would ever sit the same again. For a moment, no one spoke, as if the air itself was waiting for permission to move again. My husband swallowed hard, his eyes darting from the woman at the door to me, then to our children, and finally to the floor, where he seemed to wish he could disappear. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and unsteady, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this confession many times but never imagined saying it out loud. "This is my other family," he said, each word landing like a stone dropped into still water. 30 years. That was how long he admitted it had been. 30 years of divided holidays, borrowed excuses, double lives lived in separate rooms of the same world. A murmur rippled through the guests, shock turning into disbelief, disbelief into anger. My daughter stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the floor, demanding to know how long I had known, demanding to know how a man could lie so completely for so long. I raised my hand gently to stop her, not because I wasn't angry, but because something inside me had gone very quiet. I looked at the woman standing beside the door, noticing the way she avoided my eyes, how her lips trembled like she wanted to apologize but didn't know how to begin. I looked at the children, his children, grown now, carrying his smile, his posture, his unmistakable presence, and I felt a strange ache, not of jealousy, but of recognition. They were not ghosts. They were real, living proof of every instinct I had buried over the years. My husband began to cry then, his shoulders shaking, apologizing to the room, to the children, to God, to me. But his tears felt late, like rain after the house had already burned. And while the room filled with shock, whispers, and anger, I did the one thing no one expected. I smiled. Not because I was unbroken, but because somewhere deep inside, the truth I had carried alone for so long had finally stepped into the light. My smile confused everyone, including my husband, who kept whispering my name like it was a lifeline he was afraid to lose, but I didn't answer him. I thanked the guests calmly, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me, and told them we needed a short moment as a family. The room buzzed with unanswered questions as I turned and walked down the hallway toward our bedroom, every step heavy with memories, arguments that never happened, questions I never pressed, nights I slept beside a man who was never fully there. He followed me, stumbling over his words, apologizing in fragments, saying he had planned to tell me someday, saying he never meant to hurt me, saying he loved me in his own way. Inside the bedroom, I closed the door gently, not out of fear, but out of finality. I walked to the closet and reached behind a stack of neatly folded sweaters, pulling out a small, carefully wrapped box, its edges worn from being handled too many times without ever being opened. I had prepared it months earlier, on quiet evenings when my suspicions had finally stopped asking and started answering themselves. Because women don't need confessions, we read patterns, silences, and shifts in energy long before words arrive. I placed the box in his trembling hands and said softly, "You brought your truth into this house today. I want you to open mine." His breath caught as he lifted the lid, and when he saw what was inside, documents, dates, photographs, notes written in my own careful handwriting, his face drained of color. Bank statements showing accounts he didn't know I had access to, property deeds signed over legally and quietly, a timeline mapping his absences against birthdays, graduations, and holidays he had missed without explanation. Proof that while he was building another life in secret, I was watching, learning, and preparing. I looked at him then, not with anger but with clarity, and for the first time in 30 years, the power in the room did not belong to him. I didn't raise my voice when I spoke to him, because anger would have given him something familiar to hold on to, and I wasn't interested in familiarity anymore. I told him to sit down, and when he did, it felt like watching a lifetime of authority fold in on itself. I explained everything slowly, not to punish him, but to make sure he understood that this moment had not been born out of impulse or revenge. I told him how betrayal doesn't start with an affair. It starts the first time a man decides his partner is strong enough to survive a lie without being told the truth. I showed him how I had learned the language of documents and signatures, how I had asked quiet questions, made careful phone calls, and sought advice without ever once revealing my heart. I explained how the house we stood in was no longer ours but mine, how the business he believed was untouchable had been legally restructured, and how the future he assumed would always include my silence had already been rewritten. His hands shook as he flipped through the papers, his breath growing shallow, his voice breaking as he asked how long I'd been planning this. "Long enough," I said, because time no longer mattered. I told him I had set aside money for the other children, not because he deserved mercy, but because they did, and because I refused to let bitterness turn me into someone I didn't recognize. That was when his knees gave out and he cried, not the confident tears of a man seeking forgiveness, but the helpless tears of someone realizing the story he controlled had ended without his permission. I stood there, steady, realizing that love does not disappear in moments like these. It transforms, shedding illusion until only truth remains. And the truth was this: I was no longer the woman waiting to be chosen. When we returned to the living room, the silence was louder than any argument could have been. Every eye fixed on us as if the truth itself had taken physical form and was standing between the couches and the dining table. My husband looked smaller now, like a man who had aged years in minutes, while I felt strangely light, as though something heavy I had carried for decades had finally been set down. Before he could speak, before he could explain or beg or rewrite the moment, I stepped forward and asked everyone to listen, not for his sake, but for mine. I told them that betrayal isn't dramatic at first. It grows quietly in the corners of trust, fed by omissions and excuses until it becomes a second life. I spoke to my children, telling them that love should never require self-erasure, that marriage is not endurance but mutual respect, and that silence is not loyalty when it costs you your dignity. I turned to the other woman then, meeting her eyes for the first time, and told her I didn't hate her, because hate would keep me tied to a pain I was finally ready to leave behind. But I also would not share my future with someone who had shared my past without my consent. I thanked my husband for the honesty he had brought so late, because it gave me the clarity to end a marriage I had already grieved in private. Some people cried openly, others looked away in shame, and a few nodded as if they recognized their own lives in my words. Then I said the sentence that closed the chapter completely. Today is my birthday, and I choose myself. In that moment, I wasn't asking for permission, understanding, or sympathy. I was declaring my freedom, and the room felt different, like it had witnessed not a collapse, but a beginning. In the weeks that followed, life didn't explode the way people expect after a marriage ends. It softened, like a storm finally moving off after years of constant thunder. The house grew quieter, not empty, but honest. And for the first time, I could hear my own thoughts without filtering them through someone else's expectations. People checked on me daily, waiting to see me collapse, but grief had already visited me long before the truth was spoken out loud, and what remained now was clarity. I began waking up early just to sit with my coffee and watch the sunlight move across the floor, realizing how many mornings I had rushed through without ever feeling present. I traveled alone for the first time, nervous and excited in equal measure, discovering that solitude can be a companion rather than a punishment. My husband sent long messages filled with apologies and memories, reminding me of shared history as if history alone could rebuild trust. But I learned something essential in that quiet season. Love does not survive on memories, it survives on respect. I forgave him, not to restore what we had, but to release myself from carrying his choices any longer. I laughed more freely, spoke more honestly, and stopped shrinking to keep the peace. Each small decision, what to eat, where to go, when to rest, became an act of reclaiming myself, and with every passing day, I understood that healing isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's just the gentle realization that you are no longer afraid. Now, every birthday feels entirely different, as though the calendar no longer marks the passage of years, but the passage of freedom, and I wake each morning with a quiet gratitude that I never knew I could hold. That small box I handed my husband, the one that contained proof, evidence, and my careful planning, was never about revenge. It was about closure, about finally taking back the narrative of my life from someone who tried to live it alongside me in secret. I tell this story not to boast or to invite pity, but because somewhere out there is another woman who smiles through suspicion, who wonders if she is imagining things when her intuition has been screaming the truth for years. She is not imagining it. And if she is listening, she needs to hear this. You do not have to wait decades to choose yourself, and you do not have to shrink or hide your pain to preserve someone else's comfort. Truth hurts, yes, it always does. But living a lie hurts longer, and sometimes the calmest, quietest, most composed smile in the room belongs to the woman who has already won, long before anyone noticed. I have learned that strength is not loud or flashy, it is steady, persistent, and patient. It is waking up to sunlight after nights filled with doubt. It is setting boundaries when others expect compliance. It is choosing yourself, day after day, in ways both small and enormous. And as I light my candles now, surrounded by friends who have become family, and by the silence of a home I finally own for myself, I feel an unshakable peace. The world may have expected my story to end in heartbreak, but my story ends in truth, in dignity, and in freedom. And that, I think, is the most beautiful birthday gift of all, because this time, it was for me.